All right, so this week in IXL, we are doing like vocab, like synonyms and antonyms. But today's lesson, we're gonna still do a little work on informational text. So I'm gonna ask you a couple of questions. We're gonna watch a video. We'll look over the text version of it, then answer a few more questions. And then after that, if you have questions about this week's assignments, that's gonna be it for the whole class. Sound good?
Yeah.
All right, perfect.
Yeah.
All right, so you should be seeing the PowerPoint now. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. All right. So this is about voting rights. It's from PBS Learning. Here's some key vocab for you to know before we watch it. Ariani, why don't you go ahead and read what the Voting Rights Act is?
Voting Rights Act, a 1965 law signed by Lyndon B. Johnson that eliminated poll taxes and literacy tests and required that states be accountable to the federal government when enacting election laws. Voter. Continue.
Hold on, I was letting someone in. Where were you?
Lucky Charm.
It's enacting.
So you want me to continue?
All right, ID laws. Damien, go ahead and read that.
Laws that require voters to show some form of identification at the polls, such as driver license. Voter ID laws vary by state, with some requiring a photo ID, others requiring an ID with no photo, and others that do not have any required ID to vote.
All right, in our state, our voter IDs do not have photos on them. And finally, Mahaya, go ahead and read what the 15th Amendment is.
The 1870 amendment that gave all citizens the right to vote regardless of race.
Okay, perfect. All right, now, who in this country is allowed to vote? Or who was allowed to vote in this country, as it really says?
American citizens that are 18 and up.
Yes. Now, what are some restrictions on voting? Who is not allowed to vote?
Immigrants.
People under 18?
People what?
Under 18?
People under 18, yes. Immigrants can vote if they are, if they're legal citizens of the country or if they have a resident alien card or a green card. Anyone know any citizens who are above 18 that are not allowed to vote?
Felons.
Felons, right?
Doesn't have ID.
Criminals.
Yes, convicted felons right now do not have the right to vote, but they may be getting the right to vote.
Can I ask why they don't have the right to vote?
I don't know. It's part of what happens when you're a convicted felon. You have to report it on job applications and you're not allowed to vote.
Okay.
And then how do you get a voter's ID?
Don't you have to register?
You have to register to vote. Yes, absolutely. You can do it when you renew your registration now or your driver's license. But that's as simple as it is. Now we're going to watch this video.
So how much did the Voting Rights Act change the political landscape over the past 50 years? Joining us now for some insight is John Harwood, chief Washington correspondent for CNBC and political writer for the New York Times. So we've thought about that big picture, the march that is seared in people's minds. What kind of change has happened since then, especially for voting rights?
Well, first of all, you've seen a complete collapse of Republican support among African Americans. That happened very quickly. Richard Nixon got about a third of the black vote in 1960. Barry Goldwater got 6%. Republicans have never approached that Nixon level since. Second, you've had blacks and non-whites in general, including Hispanics and Latinos, expand as a proportion of the electorate. And over time, that has worked to the advantage of the Democratic Party. 1964, when Lyndon Johnson was reelected, whites provided about 95% of all the votes cast in the election. In 2012, rather, whites were about 72%. And that growth, given the shift of whites to very dominant support for the Republican Party, non-whites for the Democratic Party, has produced a racially polarized electorate, but one that, given the growth of non-whites, has worked to the Democrats' advantage in presidential elections lately.
So there are Democrats and some Republicans that will be there today or through the weekend in Selma. But what happens when they go back to Washington?
When they go back to Washington, they're going to take the places that they've become accustomed to in this polarized environment that we're have been living with for some time. President George W. Bush is going to represent Republicans, but you don't have Republican leaders in Congress going down. Although, interestingly, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell himself was a supporter of civil rights at the time of Selma, as was some of the Republican politicians that he worked for in Kentucky at that time. But we've seen a pretty dramatic shift in the party's stance on civil rights related issues. Republicans have become almost entirely a conservative party. Democrats left of center, and that is those are the contours that they're going to resume when they get back to Washington.
How have some of the recent events, the 2013 Supreme Court decision and the Voting Rights Amendment Act that are trying to work their way through Congress, how are they impacting this conversation?
Well, you've seen southern states try to get out from under the aegis of the Voting Rights Act, and they've had some success in the courts at doing that, reducing the burden of proof on southern states to justify their electoral arrangements and processes. While that's gone on, you've had a reversal in the makeup of legislatures and also congressional delegations from southern states, where pretty much all the Democrats now are black from southern states, and there are no white southern Democrats left in the Congress, very few, if any. And that has changed the political conversation. It's made the South the epicenter of the modern Republican Party. And one of the challenges for Republicans going forward is trying to break out of that base, expand their support in the Northeast and the Midwest, if not the Pacific Coast, which is very strongly in the Democrats' favor at the moment.
All right, John Harwood joining us from Washington, D.C. Thanks so much.
You bet.
All right, so if you just got into class, don't worry about missing the video. We're going to go through and read the text. As soon as I figure out how to. All right, so here is the text.
So how much did the Voting Rights Act change the political landscape over the past 50 years?
No. All right, so how have voting rights changed in the past 50 years? All right, who wants to go ahead and read for me, please?
I'll do it.
Mahaya, go
The
ahead.
50 years. Oh, shoot.
She raised her
Well,
hand.
who's reading?
You want me
Oh,
to do
my
it?
fault.
Whoever wants to.
Okay. Read the whole thing or?
Read as much as you want, and then pass it to
Okay.
someone else.
The 50th anniversary of the marches for voting rights in Selma, Alabama brought a new focus to the relationship between race and voting today. We just need to open our eyes and ears and hearts to know that this nation's racial history still casts its long shadow upon us. President Barack Obama said in an address commemorating the marches. Ariana, you can read.
Up until the Voting Rights Act of 1965, poll taxes, literacy tests, and voter ID laws hindered the constitutional right of racial minorities to vote. When protesters gathered at the Edmund Pettus
Edmund
Bridge in
Pettus
Selma
Bridge.
on March 7th, 1965. Edmund. In 1965, police attacked them, shocking the nation. Following the marches, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act, which eliminated poll taxes and literacy tests and established greater oversight of state voting laws. Somebody else could read.
Anyone?
50 years later, the percent of people of color in the electorate has expanded, but for the alignment by race has become more pronounced. According to John Harwood, Chief Washington correspondent for CNBC.
In
In 2012,
No, go
in
for it.
2012, the percentage of turnout among Black voters exceeded that of white voters for the first time. And as turnout has expanded, the number of Black Republican voters has dwindled. A 2012 Gallup poll showed that only 2% of Black voters identify as Republican.
Today, 34 states have voter ID laws, including a large percentage of southern states. These laws disproportionately keep minority and young people from voting, and Obama has criticized the laws as prohibitive to voters. A 2013 Supreme Court decision weakened the Voters' Right Act by stating that states no longer require federal oversight and to change election laws, including voters' ID laws.
All right, perfect. So now we're just
You're
going.
welcome.
Oh, thank you. All right, so why are voting rights important? Gianna.
Because it's the right of the people to choose their president.
Yes, it is our right to pick who leads this country. Perfect. Now, what resources does a person need to get identification? And then, second part, who might have a difficult time obtaining an ID?
Criminals, people have a felony.
Criminals will definitely have a difficult time. But based on that text in the video, who else is having a difficult time obtaining voter IDs?
African American minorities?
Yes, because of these voter ID laws. And then, you know, in the 60s, they had poll taxes. So absolutely. And then to get a voter ID, it's pretty simple. How do you think you get a voter ID card?
You register?
Apply for 'em?
Yeah, you register to vote, which you can do once you're 18. So when I was 18, I registered to vote, but I couldn't vote because of when I turned 18, I couldn't vote until I was like 21 or something because there was no presidential election around then. I know, it's fascinating. Such a good story, Mr.L. So interesting. All right, finally, as soon as I move this out of the way, how does voting access determine who wins an election? Zosha? I mean, it's literally as simple as it sounds. How does voting access determine who wins an election?
Is it the popularity vote?
By voting,
Yeah, the more people that
by
vote
vote.
can determine who wins an election. If you look at 2008 and 2012, minority vote, including African Americans, the biggest turnout ever, helped President Barack Obama become President Barack Obama. And then in the last election, minority vote was down, and our president is President Trump. So I don't know how it'll happen. I don't know how we're even going to vote this November, to be honest, whether we vote in our houses. It's going to be interesting, or the same. All right, so I'm going to stop recording this.